Germany, September the 12th, 1919. At the Sterneckerbrau restaurant, located in the heart of Munich's Old Town, history is about to be changed by a single man.
He was basically a loser. I mean, his chosen profession, to be an artist, he was a failure. He barely earned a living. There was nothing that would mark him out for greatness.
For the past few months, a new political movement known as the German Workers' Party has been holding regular meetings at the Lieberzimmer on the first floor.
He had attended a lecture in which a professor had advocated Bavaria splitting off from the rest of Germany. He got up to rebut this professor, and he launched into a tirade, and when he stopped speaking, he looked around and he could see people with their mouths hanging open.
That stranger's rant would impress Anton Drexler, the founder of the German workers' movement, who would invite him to join the party. Drexler would later write to a friend,
"An absurd little man has become number 7 in our party."
13 years later, on January the 30th, 1933, and that absurd little man would be saluted and acclaimed by thousands on the packed streets of Berlin as the new Chancellor of Germany.
We read that a funny little man called Hitler had come into power in Germany.
The Nazi Party became a huge organization, and when we see the propaganda tactics that they did, it becomes obvious how much money was needed.
But how was that even possible when Germany had been on her knees economically since the end of World War I? Who paid for the massive propaganda machine that helped Hitler become a media sensation, tour the country in a private airplane, and even build his own private army?
It's backed by these petitions signed by prominent far-right politicians and industrialists and bankers. You've got a lot of powerful people supporting Hitler.
Was Hitler being manipulated by the shadowy financiers and industrialists who were funding his irresistible rise to power? Or was Hitler the one doing the manipulating?
All along, when they started to say that he was a puppet of big business, Hitler said, "Come and have a look at the accounts of the Nazi Party, and you'll see that all of our money comes from membership fees."
August 1936, the height of the Nazis' glory and power. Hitler was the supreme Führer of a resurgent German Reich. Its growing economy was admired and envied by leaders from around the world who flocked to the epic opening ceremony of the Berlin Olympics. Not even the triumphs of America's new track and field star could spoil Hitler's opportunity to show off on the world stage. A few months later, in a note in his diary, Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, couldn't help but reflect on the meteoric rise of the Nazis since their chaotic attempt to stage a coup and seize power in the abortive Munich beer hall putsch of 1923.
How poor we were then. The Führer tells how he wanted to shoot himself once, because the bill debt grew over his head.
Goebbels was writing about a time when the very idea of Hitler as Führer of Germany would have been laughable, when the man who would become Germany's supreme leader was fresh out of prison for his failed beer hall putsch of 1923, banned from speaking in public, and struggling to keep his party against internal divisions and soaring financial debt. This was the third devastating blow Hitler had suffered in his life, after losing his beloved mother to breast cancer when he was just 18. And then, the humiliation of defeat at the hands of Britain, France, and America in the First World War. Back then, Hitler was a mere army corporal. Though Austrian by birth, he had proved his loyalty to Germany and her Prussian ideals by his bravery in the trenches.
There was nothing that would mark him out for greatness except that he had won the Iron Cross. When he joined the German army in World War I, they put a rifle in his hand, they gave him self-discipline, they taught him how to kill, and he was a completely different character coming out of that war.
After the German capitulation, Hitler feared for his future in the army, the only place where he had so far found the purpose and recognition that he was looking for. But the impoverished and increasingly desperate Weimar Republic would be fertile hunting ground for his extremist ideas.
And of course, we have these sort of famous images of people taking wheelbarrows full of money to buy one loaf of bread and a bit of ham. It is absolutely chaotic. The country is in a mess. So that creates a lot of resentment. And what you get emerging in Germany is increasing political fanaticism. So what you've got is a country becoming more and more poor, more and more fanatical. It's the perfect breeding ground for a fanatic like Adolf Hitler.
During his military service, Hitler had shown he had the gift of gab and a knack with public speaking, with which he had openly voiced his strong nationalist beliefs. This was something the new German army, the Reichswehr, could make good use of. At the end of the war, he would be drafted into the army's new education and propaganda division.
He kept on an army salary, and his job was to talk to the troops before they were demobilized and keep them loyal to Germany and the army, keep them from going over to communism. And his commander was a Captain Marr, who spotted his talent early.
Captain Karl Mayer was a young, ambitious officer with a talent for picking the right agents and choosing the right missions. These skills earned him the commanding post of the Education and Propaganda Department in Munich, and he would be the man who, with the help of the Army's secret slush fund, would kickstart the Hitler money trail. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles had dictated that the German army should be limited to only 100,000 men. To tackle these terms, the commanding officers created a special money reserve that would be kept under the noses of the Allied Supervising Commission and finance a secret army reserve named the Black Reichswehr. This was mostly formed by nationalist private paramilitary organizations made up of demobilized soldiers from the Great War and known as the Freikorps, who would be used to fight and contain the growing number of communist uprisings in the streets.
There's no doubt that some of these paramilitary groups were being financed by the army because the army had the intention of suppressing socialism. In a way, the army in Germany was a kind of state within a state. It was sort of saying, look, we call the shots here. We want to have a big say in who rules Germany. So that's why the army was getting involved.
Black Reichswehr funds would also be used to infiltrate newly emerging political organizations and disrupt those who could pose a potential threat to the army, or support those who were sympathetic to their aims, such as the German Workers' Party.
They get Hitler to go along to a meeting of this Deutsche Workers' Party led by Anton Drexler, and he goes along. He's supposed to actually be eavesdropping on them to take information.
And that's how Adolf Hitler would be invited to join the German Workers' Party, the DAP, which would eventually become the Nazi Party. Karl Mayer trusted his agent's capacity and would give him an extra 20 gold marks a week on top of his salary for the young corporal to help in the fledgling party's expansion. Mayer's investment paid off. In just a few weeks, Hitler would organize his first public speech on October the 16th, 1919, before an audience of 111 people. On February the 20th of the following year, more than 2,000 would listen to the presentation of the 25-point party program at the Hofbrauhaus in Munich. Hitler would soon become the party's star speaker, mesmerizing audiences hungry for someone who could show them a new direction. In 1921, Hitler would be elected the leader of the now rebranded National Socialist German Workers' Party, and his rapid rise to prominence would be noticed by the party's first serious potential financiers. Having helped to put the newly rebranded National Socialist Workers' Party on the map, star speaker Corporal Adolf Hitler was attracting attention from some unexpected circles.
Hitler bekam schon in seinen frühen Jahren Unterstützung von Unternehmern, aber das waren keine großen Unternehmer, sondern es waren mittlere bis kleinere Unternehmen. Zu den Unternehmen gehörte ein Münchner Verleger namens Bruckmann oder auch die Erbin der Klavierbauerfirma Bechstein, die Hitler in die Münchner Gesellschaft einführten und ihn sicherlich auch mal finanziell unterstützten.
Then there were those who, besides financing Hitler personally, would also become fundraisers for the party. The first would be Dietrich Eckart, one of the founding members of the party and a father figure to Hitler, who would introduce his protege to the higher echelons of German society. Then there was Emil Ganser, the man who would introduce the Nazis to the Berlin business community, organize lectures, and organized fundraising trips to Switzerland. There was also Ernst Hanstengel, who would loan $1,000 to bail out the party's newspaper from bankruptcy, and would become one of Hitler's close confidants. Kurt Ludecke, a shady dandy who made a small fortune gambling and with dodgy businesses, who became the international fundraiser and the man who would connect the Nazis with the Italian fascists. And also Max Erwin Schubner-Richter, a Baltic German who fought the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War and who would become a key connection with exiled white Russian families all over Europe. But still, all the money raised was inadequate to cover the party's growing expenses.
When we sort of talk about the influences on Hitler in terms of money, we need to be clear about how much money is being given. And in this sense, we're talking about minuscule amounts of money. It helped Hitler to tick over. Hitler didn't have a job and he wasn't claiming unemployment benefits, so therefore he needed some money.
Bigger donations would soon start to arrive, and when they did, they'd come from an improbable source.
If you read the New York Times from the 20th of December 1922, that early on, that article accuses none other than the very, very rich and famous American industrialist Henry Ford of actually supporting the Nazis.
Among the Nazi Party's most fervent and prominent early supporters in the early 1920s was Winifred Wagner, the daughter-in-law of famous composer Richard. While touring the U.S. with her husband in the early 1920s, the Wagners would be invited to the estate of famous American car manufacturer Henry Ford for dinner. Later, when interviewed by writer and historian James Poole, Frau Wagner would confirm the rumors.
When I was doing my interviews with Frau Wagner, who was the daughter-in-law of the composer Richard Wagner, I said to her, "Some people think Ford gave Hitler money." And she said, "Oh, I know I did." I said, "Well, how do you know?" She said, "I was the one that arranged it." The money was transferred by a man who worked for Ford named Boris Brazel. So Brazel had been a Russian prosecutor, and after he fled Russia, escaped successfully, and then went to work for Ford. So it was Boris Brazel that carried the money from the US to Germany, where it was given to Cyril Romanov, who was the pretender to the throne, passed it to Ludendorff, and then to Hitler. There was never any evidence of this. There were no documents of it. Fortunately, I was just in my 20s when I interviewed Frau Wagner, and she was about 80 at the time, and then in a couple of years, she died. So she was the last living link that knew this.
One name from this secret transaction who would go on to play a crucial role in Hitler's money trail was Erich Ludendorff. General Ludendorff, a German war hero of great standing, would become an important conduit between right-wing militarist organizations like the Nazis and prominent industrialists like German steel magnate Fritz Thyssen.
In 1923, he meets Ludendorff, who at the time is a very pivotal figure in the Nazi movement. And Ludendorff says, look, come on, why don't you come along and watch a speech by Hitler? And, Thyssen, of course, is thinking, who is this guy? I've never heard of him.
Thyssen war extrem antisozialistisch, war auch antiparlamentarisch und hatte große Hoffnungen, einen starken Führer, der Deutschland wieder als politische Macht und militärisch stark machen und die Sozialdemokratie und die Kommunisten und die Gewerkschaften bekämpfen sollte.
I followed his advice. I attended several public meetings organized by Hitler. What impressed me most was the order that reigned in his meetings, the almost military discipline of his followers.
Military discipline at Hitler's public meetings was kept by the Nazi Sturmbannteilung, the SA, the paramilitary wing of the party that not only provided security in the rallies, but were dispatched into German cities to stir up trouble, which they could then brutally suppress.
There's a famous Elton John song, it's called Saturday Night is All Right for Fighting. But in Weimar, Germany, every night was all right for fighting because there was fighting all the time, tremendous violence.
It was German nationalist and Hitler confidant Kurt Lüdecke who would take that bunch of Nazi thugs to the next level. He alone would finance the first uniforms, weapons, and logistics, and appoint as their head an old comrade of Hitler's and an early party member, Captain Ernst Röhm.
Ernst Röhm was one of the leading figures in the Reichswehr, in the army. He was actually the commander of Hitler. He was already in this German Workers' Party. We don't know whether he was in the party to infiltrate it, but there's good evidence that yes, he was.
Röhm had a keen eye for business, and right after the end of the Great War, he'd made a tidy sum of money by smuggling weapons to the Freikorps. All his deals were off the books and highly illegal. His efficiency in moving weaponry illegally under the noses of the authorities earned him the respect of the Black Reichswehr, and which in turn enabled him to recruit experienced military men to the Nazi cause.
Röhm definitely had access to weapons. He had access to, for example, it was very important for Hitler to be able to mobilize these men and go from one town to another. Röhm had access to trucks to supply them. So he was a key figure very early on.
There's no evidence actually linking sort of payments to Röhm from the army, and then he gives wages to these stormtroopers. No, the stormtroopers paid membership fees to the Nazi Party. And then the Nazi Party may have helped them out, some beer, which they would have liked, some food, but it wasn't really rich enough at that stage to actually do anything. The Nazi Party didn't have a lot of funds in the early days.
With Röhm now on board and the Thyssen-Ludendorff axis now in place, they had the beginnings of a network of senior military figures and industrialists, which could bring in a steady flow of money and manpower to the party's cause. Fritz Thyssen, in particular, was now ready to place a big bet on Hitler and the Nazis.
I gave him about 100,000 gold marks. That was my first contribution to the National Socialist Party. These funds, however, I delivered neither to Hitler, neither to Scheubner-Richter, but to Ludendorff, who I desired to use it as best as he could. I did not examine the details of the plans evolved by him and Hitler. I have already said that I did not wish to mix in politics.
And Hitler and Ludendorff had an audacious plan to put Thyssen's money to work straight away.
He hears about Mussolini's march on Rome, so he knows that the fascism is on the rise, and he has this idea that they want to take over the local Bavarian government, then they're going to march on Berlin.
Emboldened by Mussolini's dramatic move, Hitler took to the streets of Munich on November 9, 1923, with 3,000 of his stormtroopers, supported by Ludendorff and other prominent nationalists, demanding the Nazi Party be installed as the new government of Bavaria. Unlike Mussolini's PNF, however, there was no public acclaim for the Nazis and no popular uprising in their support. Instead, armed police were sent in to break up the insurrection. The resulting violence left 14 Nazis dead, and Hitler and his leadership colleagues on the run. They would all be rounded up and tried as conspirators for plotting to overthrow the government. With Hitler in prison and the Nazis in disgrace, he and Thiessen would have to go their separate ways. But not for long. Emerging from his 9-month incarceration in Landsberg prison, Hitler knew exactly what he needed to do to revive his and the Nazis' fortunes.
Hitler decides that he's going to stop trying to overthrow the government because he realizes that's going to be impossible if the army don't support him. He can't try and do it by a civil insurrection. He changes tack. He decides he's going to take the legal route to power. He's going to create now a proper political party with membership fees, organization. It's going to fight elections. It's going to need money. And he's going to try and win in the ballot box and come to power legally. Now that's important because he's given up being the street fighter and the revolutionary for being the manipulator.
His single focus was to grow the Nazi Party, and he was clever at selecting good businessmen as his allies. For example, key man was a man named Max Amann. Max Amann had been a bank manager, had been Hitler's sergeant major during the war. Hitler picked people that he knew he could absolutely trust.
Indeed, Max Amann couldn't be a better party business manager since he was pretty much the opposite of Hitler. He was highly organized, hardworking, and his banking experience allowed him to obtain credit on good terms. He would also be trusted with the running of the Nazi propaganda press. Where Hitler would think about content, Amann would think about sales and distribution. And that's how he would come up with a new idea. Though the beer hall putsch may have been in reality a bloody farce, in Amann's hands, it would be mythologized as an act of supreme self-sacrifice by Hitler and the Nazis.
And this is what makes them such amazing politicians, is that they later will turn that disaster into a kind of moment of significance, of triumph, a key moment in the establishment of this new political religion. And so when Hitler ends up in prison, it looks, as if he's become even more of a kind of Christ-like figure. He's suffering for his politics. He alone is the man, who's sacrificing himself.
For the Nazis, there was no such thing as bad publicity, and Amann was confident that they could capitalize on this momentum. So he encouraged Hitler to work on his autobiography while in prison. The book would be published in the summer after Hitler's release with the title Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. Hitler was betting on it as the political manifesto for the party's new direction. Amann was thinking about the profits. Although its initial impact was disappointing, in time it would make Hitler millions.
In actual fact, Mein Kampf doesn't sell very well originally. I think it sells about 10,000 copies between 25 and 27. It's not a bestseller, let's put it that way.
The lukewarm reaction to Mein Kampf put Hitler in a bind. With a ban on the Nazi Party still in place, how could he hope to get this message out to the German people? In February 1925, the Bavarian government agreed to lift the ban on the Nazi Party on certain conditions. Conditions which Hitler, in his excitement, broke within 24 hours at his first public speaking engagement. The ban was immediately reinstated for a further 2 years.
It was a very difficult period for him. He gets out of prison after the German recovery has begun. The currency was stabilized and the economy was pretty good. Consequently, a party like Hitler's doesn't attract many people.
Since Hitler was banned from speaking in public, he would resort to small, secretive meetings held in tiny, secluded rooms with select businessmen and industrialists. But this tactic failed initially to get results.
Big companies, they don't want to be attached with something that's going to bring them bad publicity. So what we know is that the major industrialists in the Weimar period, they support the traditional parties, not the socialist parties, but the liberal parties, the conservative parties that are around. Why would they want to get involved with the Nazi party? It's going nowhere. It's just a group of fringe people out on the streets. A respectable company would not want to get involved in it.
But on a spring evening in 1927, while giving a secret speech in Essen, there would be one man who would listen to Hitler and decide to take him seriously: 80-year-old Emil Kierdorf.
Emil Kierdorf war vielleicht einer der berühmtesten deutschen Bergbauunternehmen, einer der Führungspersönlichkeiten der Ruhrwirtschaft. Kierdorf war ein strammer Monarchist, Antirepublikaner und Antidemokrat.
Kierdorf and Hitler would first meet on July 4th, 1927, at the Bruckmanns Villa in Munich. The chimney baron, as Kierdorf was known, was very favorably impressed by Hitler's views and was curious about what else he would hear in person.
The inexorable logic and clear conciseness of his train of thought filled me with such enthusiasm with what he said. I asked him to write a pamphlet on the topics he had discussed with me.
Hitler did as Kierdorf asked and wrote a brochure titled Der Weg zum Wiederaufstieg, or The Road to Resurgence. Since some of the content was not deemed appropriate for the more working-class members of the party, it was kept as a secret publication for distribution to a privileged few. Kierdorf, who became a member of the party in August of that year, would personally hand the brochure to his closest associates and clients. The chimney baron would also introduce Hitler to his better-acquainted business colleagues in formal meetings held at his home. In this setting, Hitler had the chance to use his persuasive charm to explain his plans for the future of Germany.
Hitler war für viele Angehörige der deutschen Elite ein Emporkömmling, jemand, der nicht mal einen richtigen Schulabschluss hatte. Hitler galt also im Prinzip zunächst als politischer Parvenu, aber er konnte Unternehmer durchaus durch seine Kenntnisse über die Lage der Wirtschaft in Deutschland.
Although Hitler made a good impression, there were no financial results from this meeting besides Kierdorf's regular contributions. And Kierdorf wasn't just contributing out of the goodness of his heart. He had a very specific agenda and plan for the party. He would start to infiltrate his own people into the party and tried to push the Nazis into a more pro-capitalist, pro-business direction. This was something that the party's working-class faction, led by Gregor Strasser, resented and resisted. Used to getting things done his way, on August 12, 1928, Emil Kierdorf would write his letter of resignation from the NSDAP. The Nazis had lost their main benefactor. Nevertheless, things were about to get better for them.
In 1928, the Nazi Party polls about 2.8% of voters. So the strategy of coming to power peacefully isn't working that well. In 1930, though, the vote goes up to around about 12%, and about 6 million people vote Nazi. So something happens between 1928 and 1930.
What happens is a global economic collapse. On October the 29th, 1929, the American stock markets crashed and the Great Depression began. Germany was back in a deep economic crisis, just like in the good old days before the beer hall putsch, when the Nazis had first started to become popular.
Unter Handwerksmeistern und Einzelhändlern die Existenz zu verlieren, dieses verstärkte die schon bereits vorhandenen Vorbehalte und Ressentiments gegen die Demokratische Republik. Aufgrund der sehr schwierigen weltpolitischen Ausgangssituation war die Reichsregierung auch nicht in der Lage, die Krise wirksam zu bekämpfen. Im Gegenteil, sie hat sie sogar in Kauf genommen, um dadurch eine Senkung und letztlich Abschaffung der Operationen zu erzwingen. Daher war Hitler sicherlich von allen deutschen Politikern der größte Nutznießer dieser Weltwirtschaftskrise.
Fear and growing unrest at the economic downturn was catnip to the Nazi Party cause. When the opportunity came to buy the recently vacated Palais Barlow in Munich, named after its English owner, Hitler saw it as the ideal place for the new party seat. But once again, money was a problem.
Hitler approached Kehrdorff again for money, and Kehrdorff was having business problems. And so then Kehrdorff passed him on to Thyssen.
Kehrdorff would arrange a meeting between Fritz Thyssen and Rudolf Hess in late 1928. But Thyssen wasn't so keen on just giving away his money, so he opted to facilitate a generous bank loan through a Dutch bank. Thyssen was back on the Hitler money trail.
And then he becomes, very, very quickly, a huge financier of the Nazi Party. And he even admits as such in his biography, and he calls it, "I paid Hitler." And he claims he's donated more than 1 million marks to the Nazi movement. So Thyssen money is really important.
In 1929, when Germany wasn't repaying their loans, the Allies reorganized the payment system into what would become known as the Young Plan. Although it reduced the debt, it would have a heavier burden for the country in the longer term. And many Germans, especially in the business world, would be against it. Thyssen would be one of them, and that's when he decided to join the Nazis with an old political ally of his, German Nationalist People's Party leader Alfred Hugenberg.
Hugenberg was a wealthy man, not an industrialist, but he was a media tycoon. He owned cinemas and newspapers all over Germany. And he was really the leader of the nationalist right.
Thyssen and Hugenberg already had the largest paramilitary right-wing organization in the country, called the Stahlhelm, and the Pan-German League in a coalition against the Young Plan. But they were missing the support from the working class that Hitler and the Nazis could lend to their cause. While an alliance with the Nazis helped create a much broader coalition against the Young Plan, the alliance gave Hitler what he craved: financial stability.
We shall carry on our propaganda at the expense of the others. At least we are gaining access to the funds which until now were reserved for German nationalists.
On July 9, 1929, Hitler and the Nazis joined the committee to support a new law, the Law Against the Enslavement of the German People, designed to undermine and ultimately destroy the Young Plan. The Liberty Law, as it became known, not only called for the rejection of the Young Plan, but the immediate cancellation to all war reparations. The law would be submitted to the popular vote in a nationwide referendum to be held on December 22nd that year.
And then Hitler's on the newsreels in all of Hugenberg's cinemas, and this is a big break.
Though the Liberty Law would ultimately not be passed, the Nazis had many reasons to celebrate. Their fame, membership, and money had grown as never before. The worse things became with the Great Depression, the better it would become for the Nazis. When, in September 1930, the government collapsed due to the economic crisis and new elections were called, the Nazis would become the second largest party in parliament with 107 seats.
And in that period, Hitler's message starts to get through. I am the savior. And it gets through, first of all, not in the cities, but in the rural areas, because the rural areas suffer even more in this depression.
The Nazi success in the elections would attract the curiosity of a prominent figure who would change the Nazis' economic policies. President of the Reichsbank, Hjalmar Schacht. Like Thyssen and the Nationalists, Schacht himself was a critic of the Young Plan and would resign as president of the Reichsbank in late 1930 and started to tour the world campaigning against it. During a trip to the United States, Schacht would read Mein Kampf and started to look at Hitler and the situation in Germany from a different perspective.
Seit 1932 versuchte Schacht als informeller Berater Hitlers auch Einfluss auf Hitlers politische Überzeugungen zu nehmen und Hitler zu einem, kann man sagen, wirtschafts- und finanzfreundlichen Reichskanzler in Spe zu erziehen.
Sometime after his return to Germany, Schacht would attend a dinner at the house of his friend, bank manager Emil Georg von Strauss. Among the guests, he would meet someone who was already a prominent figure on Hitler's money trail, World War I fighter ace turned socialite and nationalist politician Hermann Göring.
Göring war nach 1923 Repräsentant einiger Luftfahrtfirmen im Ausland, vor allen Dingen in Schweden. Göring hatte auch aufgrund seiner sozialen Herkunft gute Beziehungen in Wirtschaftskreise und galt in Wirtschaftskreisen als unternehmerfreundlich und vernünftig.
Goering, the Great World War I flying ace, was a famous figure, and his aristocratic wife, Karin, were energetic socialites who could move in circles still closed to Hitler. He would prove an important player in Hitler's plan to woo big business. On January the 5th, 1931, the Goerings would hold a New Year's dinner at their lavishly refurbished house. Among the guests were Thyssen, Adolf Hitler, and Hjalmar Schacht. This was the ideal opportunity for Hitler to impress, and he did not disappoint.
Everything he said, he stated as incontrovertible truth. Nevertheless, his ideas were not unreasonable.
With the former head of the Reichsbank now in his camp, together with one of the country's leading industrialists and a war hero, Hitler was finally going places. (1931) was the year when Hitler intensified his approach to big business. Crisscrossing the country, he would stop off wherever he could to give public lectures, receptions, and dinners, trying to forge new alliances and lobby for donations to the party.
A really significant break that Hitler had was when Fritz Thyssen gets a speaking engagement for him at the industry club in Dusseldorf. That was where all the big industrialists. So here Hitler has a chance to talk to the wealthiest men in Germany, and he needs money.
On January 27, 1932, Thyssen would introduce Adolf Hitler to some of the wealthiest men in Germany. Sure, many of the guests would give some generous donations, but there would be a few who joined the party in the following days and whose support would grow over time.
By 1932, the Nazi Party is in much better financial shape. It's expanded, it's consolidated, and its financial problems are well on their way to being solved. It's got a lot of responsibility. It employs thousands of people. Each district known as a Gau had at least 1,000 people working for the Nazi Party. That's a lot of people to look after. But of course, the party needs to keep growing.
In that year, Adolf Hitler decided to make his most ambitious move so far, to run in the German presidential elections. And when he learned that he could only campaign for 7 days for the runoff, he thought about a bold way to reach the most people in that short period of time: to fly. Through Goering's connections in the aviation industry, the company Lufthansa provided an aircraft for Hitler's exclusive use to enable him to crisscross the country in double-quick time.
Hatte auch die gute Idee, diesen Flug auch medial zu vermarkten, indem auch noch einen Film Hitler über Deutschland produzieren ließ. So gesehen war Hitler, würde man heute sagen, der Meister also dann des Cross-Marketing und, kann man sagen, der Integration unterschiedlicher Medien. Dieser Flug wurde, kann man sagen, aus den vielen kleinen und mittleren Spenden an die NSDAP finanziert, hat sich aber teilweise auch selber finanziert. Der Grund dafür war, dass die NSDAP für ihre Wahlkampfveranstaltungen auch Eintrittsgelder nahm und für Wahlkampfreden von Hitler nahmen sie etwa 50 Pfennig Eintritt. Da Hitler teilweise Zehntausende Zuhörer bei seinen Wahlkampfreden hatte, kam da viel Geld zusammen, sodass sie diese Wahlkampagne im Prinzip selber finanzieren konnte.
Despite the immense success and popularity of Hitler's campaign, he would lose narrowly to incumbent President Paul von Hindenburg. Yet this massive investment would pay off at the following federal elections 3 months later.
He gets 37% of the vote. Over 12 million people are voting Nazi of their own free will. Now, in that election, he starts to attract white-collar workers in big cities, upper-class civil servants. He attracts people, from the higher echelons of society, not because they're losing their jobs, but they fear they're going to lose their jobs.
But despite his apparent success, this election would have a sting in the tail for Hitler when President Hindenburg refused to nominate him as chancellor, preferring instead Conservative Party leader Franz von Papen. The cost of both electoral campaigns had left the Nazi Party in desperate need of further funds. And, to make matters worse, their main benefactor, Fritz Thyssen, had money worries of his own and was having to nationalize part of his empire to avoid bankruptcy. Still, the Nazis were now the strongest party in parliament, and they wouldn't hesitate to use their influence to leverage political and economic advantage.
But what Hitler was good at doing was getting money out of people. So in many ways, it's kind of like a mafia operation. You know, give us the money. And if you don't, maybe bad things are going to happen to you.
And this is when one of Germany's largest industrial conglomerates would join Hitler's money trail, the massive chemical cartel IG Farben. Founded in 1925 as the conglomeration of 6 leading chemical companies, IG Farben would become one of the largest industrial corporations in Europe. But they had a problem.
They make a food dye called butter yellow that was put into the butter in most of Europe. And they discovered that their workers that handled this food dye were getting cancer at a much higher rate than the general public. It was about to break as a scandal in the Reichstag. So they went to the Nazis and said, if you can suppress this, our money will flow to you.
And this was the beginning of perhaps the most infamous partnership with big business during the Third Reich and the Second World War.
This is a company that really gets involved with Hitler's regime. It actually helps to finance the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. It's a kind of, if you like, private enterprise state activity where the SS and the IG Farben join together, but it is a company you can call a partner in crime.
With IG Farben's backing, the Nazis would use their strength in the Reichstag to overthrow von Pappen's government in a vote of no confidence. New elections were called, and Hitler and the Nazis would once again be the outright winners, although with a marginally reduced majority. This is when Fritz Thyssen and Hjalmar Schacht would make their crucial move to put pressure on President Paul Hindenburg to nominate Hitler as chancellor. They drafted a petition called Industrialieneingabe.
Diese Petition jedoch hatte weitaus weniger Unterstützer gefunden, als es die Initiatoren Fritz Thyssen und Hjalmar Schacht erhofft hatten. Zu dem Zeitpunkt wollte sich eine Mehrheit der deutschen Wirtschaftselite noch nicht auf einen Kanzler Hitler festlegen, weil man ihn immer noch für etwas schwer berechenbar hielt und auch nicht wusste, ob er wirklich seine Macht verantwortungsvoll nutzen würde.
The old president would once again stubbornly refuse to nominate Hitler as chancellor. Even though he had won the latest election, Hitler was worse off than he had ever been before. To regain the political initiative, he needed a miracle. And the saint who would perform this miracle would be none other than former Chancellor von Papen, whom the Nazis had helped overthrow the previous summer. Von Papen was desperate to find a path back to power and thought he might succeed in convincing Hitler to accept the vice-chancellorship of the state, with him as chancellor. But Hitler was ready for this offer and told von Papen that he would only agree to such a deal if he, Hitler, were nominated chancellor, with von Papen as vice-chancellor. Von Papen, naively thinking that with Hindenburg's help he could control Hitler and the Nazis, stupidly agreed.
Entweder ich werde Reichskanzler oder ich bleibe in der Opposition. Und Franz von Papen und der Vorsitzende der Deutschnationalen Partei, Alfred Hugenberg, waren beide bereit, diese Vorbedingung Hitlers zu akzeptieren. Und wir wissen ja alle, das war der große Fehler.
After 13 years of struggling for every penny to keep his party's head above water, Hitler's rise to power was achieved with something that no money in the world could buy: von Papen's naivete. A few days later, von Papen would meet with President Hindenburg to make his case.
He says to Hindenburg, in 6 months we'll have him squeaking in the corner like a mouse. And so Hindenburg says, okay, I'll go along with it. He said, but God help me if I'm wrong here.
God help him indeed. The only consolation would be that he would not live to see the catastrophe he had unleashed.